Hi, I'm Michael,
And I'm Justin.
and this is our podcast where we discuss what we find interesting about the intersection of Web3 and digital security as we know it.
Between us, we have years of experience securing digital products and infrastructure, which has led us to be constantly curious about what's next.
Which is what this podcast is about, sharing our journey as we update our mental models for security in the next internet.
Hello, and welcome back to Not Your Crypto Podcast. I think this is episode 12. That sounds about right, doesn't it,
Sounds
Michael?
about right. A dozen.
Yeah, I know. We're there. Nicely done. Never thought we'd get this far. I hope you're well. How are you doing? It's now approaching autumn, fall, as we say over here.
Yeah, it is. It got colder past couple days here, which was a nice change.
Yeah, I remember. This is your favorite season, right?
Oh, yeah, always.
Yeah, the leaves starting to turn cold. Although it is unseasonably warm still in Toronto, where I am. But otherwise, yeah, it's very pretty. It's very sunny. The leaves starting to change color. There is a bit of a chill in the air in the mornings and the evenings, but the daytime's still quite warm. But yes, so this week, let's crack on. What are we talking about this week, Michael?
This week we are going to talk a little bit about regulation, I think.
Yes, I think that sounds like a cool topic to talk about. It's funny because I was watching a documentary on FTX last week, and one of the things they talked about is how SBF was campaigning for regulation, and that kind of got me sparked. And oh wait, hold on, what do they mean by regulation? Then you dig a bit further, you scratch the surface, you're like, oh, they're talking about it in a very narrow way. So yeah, I figured it would be a good topic for us to explore, especially as product security people. Not so much when you're in the security space. There are lots of different aspects to it, lots of different domains. Some of them are affected by regulation and compliance more heavily than others. When it comes to doing application security, product security, which is kind of the daddy of application security, you definitely see regulation and compliance crop up a lot more than you would, for example, if you were in, I don't know, infrastructure security. That's just off the top of my head. What do you think, Michael? Do you think that's an accurate statement to make, or?
Yes, I think so. What was the what was the statement?
That you definitely see compliance and regulation crop up more as a subject when doing product and application security than you would, especially consumer facing application and product security, than you would if you, for example, were an infrastructure security specialist.
Do I agree with that? Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. Well, especially recently, in terms of the developments going on with like privacy regulation and all that, that's probably one of the big domains.
Yeah.
That one would come across right now, and I think
definitely
that's certainly more a concern on the product side, but also not a concern.
Yeah, it's not a concern. All that. Agreed. 100%.
But yeah, no, I think I agree with that.
Yeah, and you're kind of foreshadowing one of the big topics we're going to get into later on. So effectively, today we're going to talk about regulation and Web3, because we kind of know its impact on Web2. We work through it every day in our careers, work with it in every day in our careers, and advise against it and consult on it, etc., etc. So we're like, okay, the idea we have here is, well, how does that work in a Web3 world, especially as a lot of these Web3 companies are now starting to grow up in terms of how their offerings. They're starting to branch outside of just the financialization stuff. They're trying to build fully fledged applications, obviously, albeit on a different infrastructure, but they're trying to build fully fledged applications that will obviously start to consume data, host data, or distribute data on the network, etc., and manipulate data. So then the question becomes: are they becoming perilously close to becoming in scope for regulation and compliance and standards? Will standards apply to the companies or the decentralized entities or the centralized entities that create these decentralized applications? So that's kind of the question. And this is just an exploratory episode where Michael and I are just going to shoot the breeze on where we think it can happen, why we think it would apply, where we think it doesn't apply, and where we think Web3 kind of steps outside of that box, or where we think Web3 is unknowingly or naively navigating towards making the same mistakes that happened early in Web 2. Not even early. Right now, we still see this in our careers with companies, established companies, not being aware of certain pieces of regulation in terms of what their application must do and must not do. So yeah, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So then moving on from there, it's like, for those who may not be so au fait with what regulation matters or why it matters to security engineers, or what regulation there is, we can just do a brief overview. So effectively, especially in application security, as Michael said, there are different pieces of legislation that also differ depending slightly, not massively, but slightly, depending on the jurisdiction in which they cover and the scope in which they cover, that apply when an application starts to consume data, specifically data about living people and dead people, I guess, as well. People. And this can work this can affect an application in a myriad of ways. It can affect an application in terms of what it can do. It can affect an application in terms of what it should do when someone asks for data about themselves, or it can affect an application in terms of how it hosts the data and what it's supposed to do in terms of the entity that owns the application, how they're supposed to protect that data and access to that data and things like that. So that I'm obviously kind of foreshadowing the big one that Michael already has mentioned, which is privacy. I'm European, so obviously GDPR is the main flavor of the month for me, and that's kind of what I cut my teeth on in terms of learning about the rights of a user from a privacy standpoint, in terms of who owns what data, which, spoiler alert, the user owns the data. The company is known as basically the custodian in that instance, and therefore as a custodian you are obligated to do certain things. There is also financial compliance as well, the most well known of which is consumer financial, which would be PCI DSS. If you're taking payments, processing payments, taking credit cards to do things, that is another famous piece of legislation. That one's international. That one's actually written by the card payment networks. So that's kind of an opt-in one. So that's not necessarily a legislative one as we would understand it from a government body, but that's actually from other businesses, a consortium of payment card networks who've come together to author that one. Michael, keep me honest on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And then from there, we have compliance that applies to businesses. So if you're a business that owns a digital application, one of the most famous ones that comes to mind is like SOC 2 Type 2, which basically talks about security standards in terms of how your business is supposed to function in general, in terms of hosting data, creating applications, what you're supposed to do in terms of change management and all the documentation you're supposed to have. And then there are standards which tend to be opt-in, but basically they are things decided by an industry or an industry sector and say these are the standards we're going to adhere to for, say, interoperability, and can touch on security as well, in terms of this is what we will do, this is what we won't do, this is how we demonstrate our efficacy in terms of security, change management, documentation, audit trails, and all of that. So it is a wide berth, and this is where we felt it's worthy of having this conversation, because again, when you come back to security, when you come back to regulation and Web3, the discussion has been very narrow. It's actually back to Michael's favorite topic, financialization, the one that takes up all the air in the room. Yeah, you can hear it, the happiness in his voice about it, because basically regulation, when it comes to when anyone's discussed it in public anyway, in regards to Web3, it's been commodity trading because of the tokens. As you know, this is not your crypto podcast. We don't really care about the crypto stuff. It's not that we don't like it. We just don't care. This is not where that forum. So we're like, okay, what about the other stuff? Because commodity trading is a whole different bag. We are not financial experts. Neither of us have worked in high finance. So we don't really care for that bit. But that's the bit that's taken up all the air. But there are other pieces of legislation that can severely hamper your business should you find yourself on the wrong side of them. Michael, is that a decent enough laying out of the definitions and terms here?
Yeah, I think so. I think like if you ask like a normal person, like a regular person, like what is regulation, I imagine the two first things they would think of are like banks are regulated in some way, and in lots of different ways practically. And then the other thing they would probably come up with is like environmental regulations or something would probably be the other thing people are familiar with, right? So like, huge broad categories of things, some of which have to do with each other, some of which don't. I think like, they talk about privacy, financial compliance, standardization, all that kind of stuff. And then, like it kind of makes sense that, Web3, crypto, blockchain, whatever, like the first kind of intersection point with the like regulated world is through the financial um, transactions, right?
It doesn't. It doesn't for me.
Okay.
I'm gonna let you finish your point, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Go on.
Well, I guess I just think about it like like part of that overall, story that we talk about between between ourselves,
Mm,
where like things financialized very soon, very quickly,
yeah.
um, and I think like out of all these different categories of regulation that we're talking about, financial regulation is probably the most like
Hmm.
active.
Yeah.
It's probably the broadest. It's the one that like is kind of the easiest to like get within the scope of,
Hmm.
and it is uh so it's, yeah, anyway, like those sorts of things are what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
um
Just
but
to start, the
why do
reason
you
why,
say
yeah,
no, or sort of not though?
because yes, when crypto came out, it was just a currency. It was just a unit of an exchange of value. But then once Ethereum came out and you started building smart contracts, the whole idea, their promise of Ethereum and all of its cheerleaders back in 2014-15 was that you're going to be able to build all these applications that actually do stuff. The world's computer, I think, was the tagline on the Ethereum's first version of the Ethereum's website. So I'm like, okay, well, you guys were always planning, or you people were always planning on building digital products. So how is it you didn't come across, or how is it regulation, the discussion didn't expand to topics such as privacy, such as compliance and standards earlier on than it has, or it still hasn't. It's, it still hasn't, as far as I'm aware. Like, it's interesting. Yeah, go on. You look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I think like I don't know. I should probably have looked at the timelines of some things before jumping on here. Like I don't know how the timeline of like Ethereum's development lines up with the timeline of like privacy regulation. Like obviously privacy regulation
Oh, that's a good question.
predates, obviously
Yeah.
predates GDPR, but in terms
Yes.
of like public consciousness and in terms of like tech companies, or other or any company practically,
Hmm.
like GDPR is sort of an inflection point in the
Hmm.
regulatory landscape of privacy.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like I should know offhand how these how these two stories like line up in time, but I think
Hmm.
it's not like straightforward. I don't think that
No,
like
I mean, GDPR
yeah.
is the inflection point. Okay, so I'm obviously going to have to talk from a UK perspective. Yeah, you had the Data Protection Act, and there's a right to privacy, there's a Privacy Act that was like 1990s. I can't remember. Someone's going to have to find out there. Then you had GDPR, where privacy rights were taken seriously and given teeth and expanded to the whole of the well, anyone who the scope was expanded massively, and basically, I think Data Protection Act and the Privacy Act in the UK were subsumed into that. The point is, GDPR is 2017. Ethereum goes public 2014, I think, or 2014, 15. So yeah, one came before the other. But at the same time, the ecosystem should have, like all Web2 companies, they were like, oh, I remember working in the UK and everyone's like, oh, there's this thing called GDPR coming down the pipe. I would assume companies building smart applications should have been aware that GDPR was coming down the pipe. Obviously, in America, the biggest privacy legislation is CCPA, and obviously in Canada you have PIPEDA. I don't know the dates for. I think CCPA came out after GDPR, and I don't know when PIPEDA came into effect in Canada. You may have to keep me honest on that, or maybe one of our listeners can. But yeah, so basically, yeah. Ethereum, technically, the idea of smart contracts and a distributed computing platform is older than GDPR. Does that
Yeah.
help change your thinking or make you think anything else?
No, like and I mean, both these things, like there's timelines to them getting implemented, adopted, developed, all that kind of
Mm.
stuff. So it does kind of feel like together in that way. Like it's not like one was way earlier, one was way later, or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think like there was also sort of a longish period where uh Web3 and like blockchain kind of stuff generally wasn't really addressed
Mm.
directly, maybe by the regulations. And maybe you could
No.
have said like, you could have interpreted it this way or that way, or whatever. I think there's since been stuff come out that does help with interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think like like taking a step back, it's probably helpful to think of yeah, one of the other points that we make, right, is that like Web3 is a bit of a spectrum
Mm,
in terms of, especially on the product side. Like if I'm supplying a product, if I'm building
hmm
like a product or an application or whatever, um, there really is a spectrum between like I'm building a regular like Web2 thing, like a
hmm
SaaS app or like some consumer facing application
hmm
on one end, and then there's like, my thing is only a smart contract or something on the other end.
hmm
Um, and then practically most products end up, somewhere in between those two things, right?
Yeah.
Like I have some interface
hmm
into the blockchain like ecosystem via smart contracts or whatever, but I
hmm
also have like some other, services in the background that
hmm
are, using that interface, but
hmm
they're like not um yeah, they're not smart contracts, they're not whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um and so like I think the way that you would interact with regulation probably depends on what your thing is
yeah.
with respect to that,
100%.
right?
And so here's where it gets interesting for me, right? Because that spectrum is dependent on I think what you're speaking to there is how centralized or decentralized a thing is. Maybe not. Or is it,
Yeah.
or have I taken a narrow sliver of that? The reason why I'm saying that is because I've just had a thought. So, for example,
Mhm.
at the time of recording, Facebook has been fined and T-Mobile got a consent decree for not basically having no real security. Well, T-Mobile had no real security. Facebook had passwords exposed to all of its engineers internally, which is a privacy what's the word, violation, because passwords are personal data and you're not supposed to expose them to anybody. That's very clear in GDPR regulation. So hence they got the fine. And now I'm thinking, okay, so I mean, you just Google any centralized exchange and a hack comes up. I'm like, okay, obviously the headline is the money gets stolen. But then I'm like, okay, these centralized exchanges definitely, according to GDPR, if you've got a customer in Europe, you're in scope. They definitely have customers in Europe. I'm surprised regulators, given how much money these centralized exchanges are generating, I'm surprised regulators haven't gone after them as well because Facebook got fined. Why doesn't a Binance get fined for? Because the data is gone, not just the money, right? In some cases, unless I don't know, maybe I'm wrong and they're only taking the 600 million and they're not taking the database, or because obviously these centralized exchanges are hosting some personal data. They've got to, especially like for example, you can even go, as we know, email addresses with your first name, last name are in scope as personal data. So chances are they've got a fair few records of personal data of their consumers or customers who are trading on these platforms. So I'm surprised regulators haven't seen them as because obviously regulators go where the money is as well. They're not going to sue a mom and pop shop for failing GDPR because there's no money there for that. There's no point in making an example of that. However, big companies where they know they can afford to pay these huge fines, or was it 4% of global turnover, or X amount of fine per data, whatever, whichever's biggest, whichever's largest. I'm surprised they haven't even looked at that because at the end of the day, that fits the classical model, right? It's a centralized exchange is just a business. They happen to interact with Web3 tech, but they're just a business and they're getting hacked left, right, and center. So, what do you think? Like, I'm surprised. That is why come back to my original point about it does and it doesn't. Because I'm like, well, you guys are building these apps and you're building these businesses around building these businesses have created these apps, and these apps are getting hacked, so and data's getting lost. I'm surprised. That's all. So that's why I think it should have, and I can understand why it didn't, because again, everyone's just talking tokens. Everyone's like crypto, crypto. That's the bit that's the most important because it's money, right? So it's obviously going to grab most people's attention. Okay, so
Hmm.
do you foresee, in saying that though, and in line with your point about Web3 applications being a spectrum, let's go into the privacy one because you're right. Some government officials in the EU that I'm aware of, I don't know if there's a North American equivalent. Maybe someone can keep us honest about that. Did pull their heads together and put out a white paper about GDPR and its effects, or more importantly, how it could be undermined in Web3. And one of the interesting things about Web3, as we all know on this podcast now, or should do by now, Web3 is about decentralization. So your data goes everywhere. The whole point is your data. When you enter your data into a smart contract, it is distributed across the entire network of nodes or validators. If you're a proof of stake network, which is most of them now, except Bitcoin, your data is everywhere. So who's responsible for keeping that data secure? There are certain rights that come with GDPR, personal data. Number one, they have to keep it secure. Number two, only people who should have access to it can have access to it. Three, there must be a right to be deleted when a user asks to be deleted. Number four, they must be able to a user must be able to ask or update it whenever they feel like. There's a bunch of others, but those are the big ones. But in a decentralized world, who's responsible for that? Who's the custodian in a decentralized world? Anyway, this white paper sought to ask those questions and answer them. And it didn't really come up with much answers. It was like, Web3 is incompatible with privacy as privacy. The basic conclusion was Web3 is incompatible with privacy legislation as it is written at the moment. However, this doesn't mean Web3 cannot be compatible with the rights. We cannot enforce privacy rights. It just needs to be legislation needs to be reimagined in a different way to take in the fact that it's a decentralized network. And B, there are definitely engineering solutions within the cryptography space that can support the rights that GDPR and CCPA are trying to protect and enforce. And so it was a really interesting white paper. It's like 120 pages long. Obviously, I'm summarizing. It's not the most interesting read. I did skip bits. But yeah, what do you think of that conclusion? Does anything stick out to you there in terms of decentralized privacy rights, decentralized rights? Or, yeah.
Like, sort of. So, okay, like you gave the example of like an exchange earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like the core exchange function, like the core kind of centralized exchange function only has like a very narrow intersection with the blockchain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Practically speaking, especially if we're talking about like like a fully custodial sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
where like I just hold an account with some like web platform, and that web platform has like a ledger that says I have X amount, and then that platform has their own wallets that have Y amount or whatever on the other side, and like the connection between my account with the platform and the actual like interaction with the chain is very little, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say like it does look like a very classical web platform from that perspective.
Some of these, sorry to interrupt you, but some of these centralized exchanges actually do KYC as well. So you upload documents, driving licenses, addresses, etc., etc. Anyway, so they are hosting. Some of them are hosting a lot of personal data.
Yeah, they do it directly, or they might use a service or whatever for it. So like, yeah, like I feel like, I don't know, that feels fairly simple to me. Now in practice, like most companies that operate exchanges don't just operate a core feature of like a fully custodial centralized exchange. They have like lots of other kind of intersections with that core function that are maybe more blockchain kind of native things or whatever. But yeah, in terms of like it feels like a bit of a cop out to just say like I don't know to the privacy in the kind of decentralized computing like paradigm. Again, like okay, like if you take that spectrum model, right? One way to look at that spectrum model is to say like you have the Web3 part of what you're doing in your product, and you have like the Web2 part of what you're doing in your product. And stuff maps pretty cleanly onto the Web2 part. And so that makes sense. And then, the Web3 part of it, stuff doesn't map very cleanly onto it. And so you just kind of carefully think about what you can and can't do with respect to that. And like kind of, I don't know, like wait.
Well, here's
for
the thing.
stuff to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
weight, and I think this is kind of when you get to the spirit of the law, right? The whole thing, these pieces of legislation are crafted to make you think twice about whether you actually need to consume this data in order to deliver your product. And I think that's what you're groping at is for the Web3 part, it's meant to make you sit up and be like, okay, well, I'm doing this decentralized thing. The data is going to go everywhere. Do I need this data to go everywhere in the first place in order to actually deliver the same experience? And what do you think? Is that that's kind of the way I'm looking at it now that I'm thinking it through?
yeah, I think so. I think so. And like I think it's possible that, and I mean, I'm sure there already even exists in some places, but I'm sure it's possible that like more kind of privacy conscious primitives
Mm.
um, will develop or kind of are being
Zero
developed or
knowledge
whatever.
proofs.
Yeah, exactly, right. And are starting to see some of them in products or make their way into some surfaces of products.
Yeah.
Uh, um, but yeah, I don't know. It feels like a cop out to say like other than that, like just think carefully about what you're doing. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what to
Yeah,
say
it's
beyond
interesting.
that.
Yeah, it's fair. And then, so this is the funny thing as well, because now, even when we go beyond privacy, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we have lots of other types of compliance. I mean, PCI taking payments, that one is kind of a no-brainer. And most companies, even Web2 companies, tend to farm that out to a third party who has gone through all of the assessments, etc. So that one's kind of an easy one. But then when we start to get into like SOC 2 Type 2, SOC 2 Type 1, which is audit trails, and how would you best summarize SOC 2 Type 2? It's almost like an accounting compliance standard, right? It's basically making sure that you do security and you have a process around how you do your security, correct?
Yeah. So a SOC 2 type 2, you said.
Yeah, SOC 2 Type 2, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the kind of meta scheme of it, meta like way of looking at it. Like there's a bunch of kind of somewhat high level objectives that you're trying to achieve, and
Yeah.
those are things about security or integrity or whatever.
Yeah, that's basically it.
You come to it as an organization and say like we have these internal kind of controls that we think achieve that higher level objective. So those might be like very specific technical controls, like things like we have 2FA, we have encryption, we have like firewall, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They might be less technical controls and more like whatever process stuff or documentation or that sort of thing. And then you go through an audit process where that gets validated that you do in fact have those controls, and those controls do in fact like achieve the objectives that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and so to my mind, that maps very cleanly. Like any Web3 company should be able to go through that, especially if you're going to be a trusted third party for any other type of company, because that's when a piece of when a certification or an assertion such as being SOC 2 certified matters, right? It matters amongst your peers when they need to do something with you. So that maps cleanly. And again, I don't see much talk of companies aiming to become like that. Obviously, it's interesting because we're basically talking about the maturity of an ecosystem here, really. But I'm like, well, this has already been learned. So why? Let's make sure that these lessons are learned as early as possible, because a lot of companies go through it. You look like you want to say something.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, I think even like SOC 2, as a kind of de facto standard for like SaaS companies to interact with each other. That is in some ways a recent thing, like what, like 10 years.
Yeah. It reminds me of? It's like CMMI, Capability Maturity Index, is kind of like, that's kind of a similar thing. That's much heavier that's less tech oriented and more just business process oriented. But yeah, it's a similar thing kind of in some of the things the requirements ask for. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah, and like like I think there's like different like kind of commercial reasons or like partnership reasons why like some of these standards, like SOC 2 or like even NIST stuff or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
have the place that they do in the Web 2 world.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of those commercial reasons are just like not there
Yeah.
for Web3, right? In terms of like the size of deals that are being made between companies, like if they're
Mm.
below a certain threshold, then internal processes for doing them are different or
Yeah.
whatever, and don't require the same things. So yeah, like I think there's probably commercial reasons that I don't actually know that much about that make the difference, but I guess that drive the maturity, right? Like you're
Yeah.
saying, like it feels like um in some ways it being in like a less mature state with respect to some of the standardization stuff and
Yeah.
compliance stuff. And I think some of that is like a lot of what drives maturity is the commercial side.
Yeah.
At some point, I don't know.
Yeah. I think so as well, especially when it's like not legislative, it's just more commercial. Yeah, it's definitely industry sectors. Like, how can we do this better and make this better? And then that brings me up to my point, right? Because I'm like, okay, so we've kind of discussed where we think some of them fit, but then it's like, okay, do we see the idea, zooming back out even higher, do we see any the idea sorry, let me try and articulate this correctly. Do we see that where there could be a need for any type of regulation or standard, well, let's forget regulation, standards or compliance for Web3? And the first thing that comes to my mind is there are a plethora of blockchains out there, and they all claim to have been built or optimized for a specific use case in mind or a specific goal. Is there a need for a consortium of these basically infrastructure companies that are kind of the ones that spin out these decentralized networks or platforms? Is there a need for them to define some type of standard? Like, for example, one of the things they like to talk about when you start researching these different blockchains, or L1s as they're called, is like their transaction per second, like their speed. Basically, are they the fastest? Are they time to consensus, time to settlement, and all of that? Do we need some type of standardization, or has one already emerged? For example, in
Do you mean
terms
in
of
terms of like measuring that?
yeah,
Like in terms of
measuring?
these different like I don't know, vectors, whatever, the different
Aspects, I guess.
aspects that these blockchains are, like, I guess you would say, competing on,
Yeah.
or like kind of proposing
Mm-hmm.
in order to compare them. I don't know.
Yeah. And then even if, for example, or is it another way of saying, or do we need standards in terms of, okay, we will all meet this standard, for example, because we will all deliver on this because this is what it should take, or I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking, because at the moment they kind of, obviously there's no collaboration between them other than bridges. Giggle, giggle, giggle. If you listen to our past last week's episode, you'll understand why I've done that. But yeah, there's not much collaboration as far as I'm aware, and from between the blockchains, or a need for it. For example, obviously there's the consumer need who wants to swap an asset for one another, and interoperability. But beyond that, yeah, do they need that? I mean, I'm not even sure they have a group in terms of lobbying on their behalf. I know they have the financial crypto industry has lobbyists and they collaborate. But do we need a technical consortium? Like you have the Cloud Security Alliance, for example, which is all cloud providers opt in to contribute to make sure that the security baselines of the cloud infrastructure is XYZ, and they'll agree and you meet it or not. And as a consumer, then you can tell them apart. Maybe blockchain could benefit from something like that. It would help, I don't know, make it easier for adoption, I imagine, from the suits, the large entities with money who are now, I have it on good word, definitely circling the industry, because they are definitely coming up with use cases where they can definitely see Web3 would actually slot in quite neatly. What do you think?
I don't know. I think like part of me, wants to be very hesitant to say that those things are an answer.
Okay.
Especially like for an ecosystem that is still in a very dynamic state where it's trying to find like product market fit, basically.
Yeah.
like standardization, regulation, like that kind of stuff has an important part to play in things at the right time,
Mm.
and in the right way.
Yeah.
But why are there all these different blockchains popping up? I mean, I think there's lots of reasons why there's different like L1 blockchains popping up. I think some of it is just because it's like easy and fun to hack on, and it's kind of a cool like thing to do.
Yeah.
I think some of it is legitimately driven by like, desired use case.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it is kind of like a proprietary sort of thing, like in terms of like wanting to commercialize stuff. It's like, well, like how do you commercialize a decentralized thing? It's like, well, you got to own the bottommost level of it, kind of thing, right? Or you got to influence the bottommost level of it.
Yeah.
And those are like those are all fine reasons
Yeah.
at the end of the day, really, to be coming up with new L1s.
Yeah, of course.
And like, does it really matter? I don't know. Does it really matter that there are all these different L1s? Like, if we find a way for them to interoperate,
it depends on who you are.
Yeah,
so,
probably, right? And
yeah.
I like, this is where I get into like less kind of knowledge. So go for it.
For me as a consumer, no, it's not even needing knowledge. Just for me as we have come at this as outsiders. That both you and I started this podcast because of conversations you and I were having, and we came at this as outsiders was because we were working on a project internally, and we're like, we need to research this stuff. Coming as outsiders, I still, even now, and I may be an advanced novice. Why there's so many different L1s, and not even why. What are the differences between them? Like, what are the actual concrete differences between them? Like, I know the difference between obviously Bitcoin, Ethereum, and I can tell that.
Between two things that are both like proof of stake and EVM compatible. Like,
I can get all that. But then, if you ask me to know the differences between Ethereum and Solana from a fundamental level, as in why. I'm like, okay, I can maybe say some things that I can Google, but I wouldn't get a deep understanding. But then again, I guess, well, actually, I can put that question on its head. What is the difference between GCP and AWS? Do I need to know that?
Yeah. I mean, I think with a lot of things, it's like the need to know depends on what scale you're operating at. Like if I'm like operating on like a single kind of transaction scale on an L1, like I'm just an end consumer who makes a transaction to interact with the app or whatever, doesn't make a huge difference, maybe. If I'm like another Web3 provider and I'm doing like, X 100 or 1,000 or whatever transactions per whatever, then probably things on the margin start to matter more to me.
Yeah, you're going to sweat the details, aren't you? Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's the same thing in the cloud, right? And with like infrastructure providers and with like software and all that. So I guess and maybe that's what I mean by like lack of knowledge. Like if we're not operating things at scale, maybe we don't know why it's important that all these different things exist. But I get your point, like from the consumer's perspective, like it kind of goes back to what we talked about way back with like adoption, right? Like Web3 adoption and crypto adoption. Like what is the hurdle to it being adopted? Like, is the hurdle a technical thing? Is it that it's like a bit impenetrable to like, is it that it's hard to onboard onto? If that's the case, then like somebody, rolling into the scene and being like, I don't know what L1 to operate on. I don't know what coin to, like, those are real and hard problems. If adoption hurdles are actually coming from another place, and it's like actually that there isn't software built on top of these things, that there isn't software built on top of these blockchains that people want to use, then maybe it is actually about what the blockchain enables and doesn't enable stuff built on top of it to do. And then maybe it actually is important that like, we kind of go through this very dynamic.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Kind of stage where there's all these different L1s that have all these different properties, because one of them is going to enable something that another doesn't.
Yeah,
and we need to like hit on that, right? So it probably depends on which direction you think adoption hurdles are coming from. And then if the adoption hurdle is like nobody cares, then like, well, okay, we can't engineer our way around that.
That is a really good point. I think you've kind of that's really good. That's a really good point. And Wow, yeah, I like that conclusion. I think that's kind of a great place to end it as in terms of regulation and whether we think it applies. The answer is it depends, and where the maturity of the ecosystem also depends on what you try, the problem you're trying to solve for. But also, um, I think a lot of it can apply. It's not necessarily that blockchain, because it's so different from Web 2, is exempt, like as we discussed earlier, in terms of business entities. And at the end of the day, data is flowing around, and that's where a lot of the regulation intersects with the actual technology, depending on what you're doing with the data and how you're processing it. So, in a lot of those instances, yes. But otherwise, yeah, I think that's a cool conclusion, a cool place to end it. Do you have any last thoughts or anything you
No,
want
I
to
think that was my last thought. Brain's
say?
done.
Okay. Okay,
Okay.
that's cool. All right. Well, we'll thank you for listening, and we will catch up with you in the next episode.